Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Strategy, Culture and Structure in a BRM Context with Paul Robinson from Corporate OASIS. Paul is a seasoned IT professional and partner with Corporate OASIS, which is an IT consulting firm whose focus is on IT practice leadership, professional development training and IT talent curation. He's had the privilege of being a member of the Mount Royal University Project Management Advisory Board and past national board member for ITSMF Canada, Service Management Forum for ITIL International, as well as serving as a catalyst for the creation of the ITSMF Southern Alberta branch. He's an experienced instructor, having taught BRMP, Business Relationship Management Professional, and that's what he's here to talk to us about today. Over to you, Paul. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Estelle, and I appreciate you taking the time to set this up with me. Looking forward to getting some feedback from everybody who has a chance to take a look at this presentation. And this is something that we've actually presented on a number of times to several of our clients. And it's interesting because what we find is every time we give this presentation, every time we do mentoring and coaching afterwards, it's never the same story twice. And really, I think what you'll find is after the session's completed here, why that's the case, particularly around organizational culture. There's almost as many organizational cultures out there as there are organizations. So what we're finding is within the context of BRM, strategy, culture, and structure, there is no magic bullet. There is no one methodology that bespoke works for every single organization out of the box. You have to really look at how your methodology around business relationship management can be pruned and pared and structured in a way that's contextual for each organization. The Business Relationship Management Institute has done a fantastic job of putting together a body of knowledge called the BRM BOK, and there is certification around that too. One of the things that we find is that after individuals take their certification and they go back to their organization, the content that they're finding in the BRM body of knowledge is very, very relevant to how they conduct their work and why they do what they do. One of the things that we find is that not only is business relationship management an important role within the organization, especially with regards to sussing out organizational culture and applying that to projects, but also a very, very important methodology, regardless of role. We like to think that business relationship management should be in everybody's DNA. So, introduction for this particular webinar. One of the things that we find is that with regards to information technology, over time, there was a period of time, years, decades ago, where information technology, or back then was called information processing, was primarily an accounting function. It was considered very much a cost center. And generally speaking, most IT departments would report up to finance. Of course, that's changed. What happens now in many, many organizations, if not all, it's really a hub and spoke visual that I can provide with IT at the center. Everything in the organization now relies heavily on information technology, not just for the enablement of technology, but just for innovation, for being able to provide enterprise processes across the organization and augment those and automate those. ERP systems are prevalent everywhere, and especially now with cloud technology, what we're finding is that to a large extent, definitely with infrastructure, but even with application development, a lot of the applications now are very much commoditized. There's a number of clients that we work with where it's very much a cloud-first mentality. And if they're going to move away from the cloud, then it has to be justified on its own merits. Because of that, what's happening is IT organizations are finding that if they're not careful, they will see within their organizational culture a lot of shadow IT popping up, where departments and divisions within the organization will start to pull in a lot of the IT functionality and run it on their own. This is why at this point in our industry, it's so key to have this business relationship management methodology, and if not a role, at least as a discipline within the organization to make sure that IT is providing value, providing relevant services, and is really seen as a trusted advisor and partner within the rest of the organization. Question is, how do you do that? Well, it's not going to be very easy if you're not aware of the organizational culture. In particular, cultures, and what we'll find in the slide deck later on, is cultures vary considerably within the context of various companies. The organizational strategy is, unfortunately, an organizational structure is something that we tend to, I think, over-focus on, and we don't really spend enough time looking at the culture of the organization. So the objective of this deck here, and we'll just go to the next slide, is how do you identify your corporate strategy, culture, and structure early in a project lifecycle? How do you adapt your behavior to a given culture? Discover where you fit into the organizational structure, particularly as a BRM. Again, that's going to be very culture dependent. How do we plan our projects and BRM met communication accordingly within the culture? How do we align our projects, programs, and portfolios to the organizational strategy and determine your role in rewarding the appropriate behavior within your team? So all of these are going to help you as a BRM to become more successful in not just applying the BRM body of knowledge and your certification and all of your experience that you bring to the table, but also looking at your role within the organization, specifically with regards to the culture. This is so key, particularly if you are coming in as a consultant. You need to understand very quickly what is the organizational culture should be like the #1 thing on your list. How do I adapt my behaviors as a BRM to the organization? Because guaranteed, organization's not going to adapt their culture to you. So what do we mean when we say strategy, culture, and structure? So just as a very high level summary, strategy is the means that the organization will utilize to achieve its objective. An organizational strategy is, generally speaking, something that's communicated from the top within the organization by the CEO, by the president. It's something that you'll be hearing from the board. And it's something that all of your projects and all of the divisions and functions and teams should be aligning to so that we're all singing off the same song sheet. Culture, on the other hand, is how do we do things around here in order to achieve that strategy, and structure is how do we organize ourselves in order to support both the culture and strategy. Now, it's interesting here because we show strategy at the top and culture next, but one of the things that I think you'll find from this slide deck is in a lot of organizations, the strategy is driven by the culture as opposed to the culture being driven by the strategy. And so this is something that you're going to have to be aware of. Is it's one thing for an organization to say this is our strategy, but if the culture doesn't align to it, then it really doesn't mean anything. So strategy, let's talk about that. Strategy is the compass used for making decisions within the organization. So if we're going to be making investment decisions, if we're going to be looking at our project portfolio, if we're going to be looking at acquisitions, really we have to go back to our strategy and ask ourselves, does this fit? So really there's two strategy categories. One is cost leadership and cost differentiation, and the other one is product and service differentiation. In some cases, you'll see a hybrid. For example, if you look at organizations like Amazon, they're very much focused on cost, as well as making sure that they're focused on product and service differentiation. So not only do they want to, I think they use customer obsession as their motto, but if they want to focus on differentiation with regards to product and service, they've certainly done a great job of that, but also heavy emphasis on cost to the customer as well, and also reducing operating costs. So they're one organization that you'll see is a bit of both. If you look at organizations, say like Apple, very much focused on product and service differentiation. Their emphasis isn't as much on cost because they know that the market is there, but they want to make sure that their products differentiate themselves, and their focus is on innovation. Their tagline, a little different than Amazon's, is think different. So you can see where their strategy falls in. Culture. So generally speaking, there are 4 major cultural subgroups. And one of the things that's interesting about this slide here too is if you look at it, you can't really, generally speaking, look at large organizations and say, we have a culture of X, of competence, control, collaboration, and cultivation. And I'll let you read through those to differentiate between each of them. But what's interesting is you'll find, to a large extent, within a culture of an organization, there is an overriding culture, by all means, but you'll also find that there's, for lack of a better term, subcultures. So the finance department may not have the same culture as the engineering department, generally speaking, won't. Engineering will have to focus on innovation. You're not going to find as much innovation in finance. They're going to be focused primarily on competence and control, whereas engineering or information technology may be looking at control and cultivation. And your supply chain, for example, very much focused on competence. So even though there's an overriding culture, you're not going to see that being as pervasive at the day-to-day level throughout the organization. And that's generally speaking by design, but sometimes it can also happen organically as well, just through different types of leadership. The one thing that we'll talk a little bit more about later is how each of these 4 major categories can work together to align to an organizational strategy. As a BRM, very, very key. Come into an organization, take a look at a slide like this and ask yourself, where do I fit within the organization based on the overarching culture, but also where do I find the subcultures within the organization, and how do I adapt my behavior to align to those? So I may not use the same set of behaviors when I'm approaching the engineering team because they're focused on control and competence, as opposed to when they're focused on control and cultivation possibly, but accounting and finance might be focused on competence. Well, I'm not going to use the same set of behaviors when they measure success differently. This is an interesting slide here. So culture and the organization. I think one of the things that I think I should mention here too, if you look at the bottom of the slide here, I have sourced my reference my sources here, and I think it's important if you can go and maybe take a look at this and just Google it. This is something that I think it's always important to just post it up on your whiteboard, post it up in your office, and take a look at this and ask yourself on a regular basis, even day to day, when I look at the individuals that I'm working with as a BRM, how is it that I need to behave, and how is it that they are going to be expected to behave, and what's important to them? How do I speak in their language that resonates with them as a BRM? Because it's one thing for me to approach an individual with an organization with a concept or with a challenge or an opportunity, but it's another thing for me to present them in a way that's going to resonate with them as an individual or with their department or their team. So for example, we talked earlier on the last slide about these 4 subgroups, the competence, control, collaboration, and cultivation. And the question is, within the context of each of them, what do they cherish? What do they celebrate? What do they prioritize? What questions do they ask? How do they lead? How are they organized? And what do they look for in terms of talent? What do they recruit for? These are really, really key, because you'll need to know, if I'm moving myself into an organization that the subculture within the team that I'm working with has a culture of control, but I'm a heavy collaborator. Well, if you look at that column, they celebrate making the plan. Your internal metric might be you celebrate teamwork. You celebrate prioritizing who I'm working with, and you prioritize the process, and you lead by the process mechanisms. Whereas the team, you can see the difference between control and collaboration. You're going to have a culture clash. So it's important, though, even though you have your own success metrics, you have your own way of doing things, that's okay. Keep those, don't lose them, but ask yourself, how is it that I can take what I know and what I learn and what I cherish and what I celebrate and apply that within the subculture within the organization? It's just really key, because if you don't do this early on, you're not speaking their language, and it can be very hard to, undo a first impression. If somebody realizes that, so for example, if you look at recruits you've just been brought into the organization, your internal cultural behaviors or collaboration, so recruit for trustworthiness, the organizational culture, they recruit for competitiveness. That may be a clash between your value systems. You need to know, how do your values and how do your behaviors work within the context of the organization. Culture and strategy. So again, we talked about the 4 different types of strategy. There's really 2 major categories, but they can be broken up into the 4 groups: operational excellence, customer intimacy, product leadership, and disruptive innovation. So just like on the previous slide, we talked about the 4 different types of cultures. Now there's the 4 different types of strategy pillars. And so if we are talking about the intersection of culture and strategy, that line in the red, that's where the magic happens. So if I want to intersect customer intimacy and cultural fit, I know this is a collaboration culture. Now I can go back to that previous grid here and ask myself, what do they celebrate? What do they cherish? What do they prioritize? Of all the slides in this deck here, this is the key one, because this one here, I can easily tell what the organizational strategy is because it's something that's documented. I can get my hands on it. And based on that organizational strategy, I can take that and I can use that lens to overlay on top of my organizational culture right here to figure out, okay, am I a control culture? Am I a collaboration culture? Am I a competence culture? Am I a cultivation culture? Once I know that from the organizational strategy, then I can go back here and I can ask myself, how should I behave? What do they consider important? How do I expect them to behave? Where are the potential political pitfalls? That basically can come out of this slide here. So this is really key. If I can leave you with one thing, it's definitely this slide here, which leads into this slide here. So lastly, there's organizational structure. Now it's interesting because organizational strategy is one of those things that, you know, you can post it up on the lunchroom walls. You can have posters in the hallway. You can have it staring, organizational strategy. You can have it staring at you over the banner of the organization. When you come into the lobby, you can see this is our organizational strategy. It's documented and I can see it and it's tactile. I can touch it. The problem with strategy though is that it means nothing if the culture doesn't align to it. There is a saying by Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's true, because what happens is if your culture doesn't align to the strategy, the culture will determine the strategy. And it doesn't matter what you have up on the wall. You can see the organizational structure. It's a document. You can hold it in your hands. You can see the organizational strategy. It's a document. Same thing. You can hold it in your hands. But the culture permeates the environment. The culture is coming out of the air vents. The culture is in the organizational DNA. It's behaviors. It's soft and it's hard to see if you're not looking in the right spots. So it can actually take over organization very easily, especially if it's not something that's instituted. An organizational culture will form within an organization. And if it doesn't form through promoting the strategy, then it will form organically. And if it forms organically, there's no guarantee that it'll align to the strategy. And at that point, the strategy means nothing. So what does that mean for structure then? There's really two schools of thought. If we get the right people and put them in the right place, things will happen. The other school of thought is we continually improve performance through training and a culture of accountability. There isn't one school of thought that's better than the other. However, a hybrid is probably going to be your best bet in an organization. So when we look at structure here, the question that you should be asking yourself is, what is the structure of the group that I'm working with? How are they hiring for that group? What do they look for in terms of accountability and competence and craftsmanship? What are they looking for? Because based on that school of thought, that'll tell you your behaviors within that organizational structure. Now, there's the structure within your team, there's the structure within the department, the structure within the division, and then the structure at the highest organizational level. So it's really good to get an indication of what that is. And if you are, especially coming in as a contractor, try and get your hands on something from HR that at least shows you the organizational structure, because then you can see, generally speaking, the organizational subcultures will follow the organizational structure. They'll be led by the leadership team, and that's by design. So get a handle on what that structure looks like, figure out where you fit within that structure, figure out who you're going to be working with and who you report to, and then ask yourself, now that I know that, what is the culture within that group? What is the culture of the organization as a whole, and how does that align to the strategy? I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the different types of organizational structures, but broadly speaking, there's three. Functional hierarchy, where basically what you've got is leadership at the top, functional managers, and when we say managers, of course, these could be vice presidents, SVPs, chief of fill in the blank. So when we say functional manager, it really is, we call it leadership at that level. And then the staff would fall into that group reporting up in pillars. So, one function within the organization might be, we'll go back to engineering. Another function might be finance. Another one might be supply chain. So you've got these very distinct pillars, and they all report up to leadership. And that can work in organizations that are, say, for example, the military would be a perfect example where you would have a very strong functional hierarchy. And it works, and it's important, and everybody knows who their leadership is. Their marching orders, no pun intended, are very well defined, and the culture will be determined at the highest level, subculture, by the functional manager, and that'll work. Some of the disadvantages, communication can sometimes fail between the different pillars, different functional areas, and it may be difficult to achieve objectives because it can be hard sometimes to align across functional areas. So another model is called divisional hierarchy. So think of an example might be the automobile industry in the say 50s through 80s and 90s in the US. They would have product divisions throughout the country. They'd have one division in one state that would produce doors, another division in another state that would produce the powertrain for a car, another one that would produce all of the automobile's electronics. And they would have different divisions, and they would focus on specific products, and then they would get rolled up together at a plant. Say, for example, in Detroit, everything comes together. Now, the nice thing about that is we can have a division running independently, operating almost as a separate entity, where they know what their success metrics are, and their culture needs to focus specifically around what they're producing for the larger enterprise. Disadvantages, though, it doesn't lend itself well to cross-pollination of methodologies. So, for example, product division A may have a great methodology for producing their product, and product division B might have a great methodology that works for theirs, but harmonizing those methodologies might be a really good idea. The problem is an opportunity to even notice that, let alone to execute on it, may never happen, simply because of the reporting structure. The biggest potential disadvantage with this is culture clash. So as we said earlier, you can take your organizational strategy and you can pin it up on the wall, and that's fantastic. But if that strategy doesn't translate into an organizational enterprise culture and have that filter down to each of the divisions, then those divisions will generate their own culture. And this is where sometimes you might find all of a sudden it's not working, say in product division C, they've generated their own subculture, maybe even subconsciously. It hasn't worked, employees aren't happy, and then all of a sudden, bang, you've got, we're going to create a union. Now, that will filter across to product division A and B. They never had an issue, they never had a problem, but because there's that chatter happening in product division C, all of a sudden they're wondering, well, why are we talking union all of a sudden? We've never even had a problem. Well, it's because something got broken in the culture in product division C. And that's led to a culture clash at the highest level within the enterprise, and that's filtering down to other divisions, and it's creating challenges that they never had, but it's happened as a result of something outside of their product division control. So you can see there's advantages and disadvantages to each, which has led to the matrix, not the movie, but the matrix structure, where you have the best of both. You've got project coordination happening across functional teams. Those functional managers, that could also be divisional as well. But what happens is we start to look at areas where we can create projects, and those projects will happen across functional areas. So you've got your operational team day-to-day, which is your vertical. So if we look at functional manager for the far left, you've got your 3 staff in there. That's your functional area, that's your operational day-to-day. But when you're building a project, it can slice across all of the different divisions or functional areas. Some of the disadvantages to this, though, is it can slow things down, because what happens is you're generally co-opting individuals for projects across the enterprise and across functional areas or across divisions. And sometimes those individuals may not have the same cadence of availability. And what can happen is then you've got issues where, how do I communicate across these different teams? And that can even become more complex when you start looking at culture, because some of those different pillars will have different cultures, but my project team cuts across it. So I've got individuals from finance, individuals from engineering, individuals from supply chain, all with different subcultures, but working on the same team. So that can work to your advantage, though, as a BRM, if you understand what those subcultures are, you understand the strengths of those cultures, and then you start to reward the appropriate behaviors. The other nice thing about this too is that as a BRM, you also have the ability, not just through the project, but also through the team here, to influence a culture that can actually permeate back into another functional area. So your team actually may have the ability to create a culture based on rewarding the right behaviors, focusing on alignment to business strategy. And as a BRM, you may be able to provide a gift back to one of these functional areas where you can enhance their culture. Sometimes that can even be right at the HR level, where some of those rewards for appropriate behavior can even be monetized. So just keep those things in mind as a BRM, is how can you not just align your behaviors with the organizational culture, but how can you even influence them? Because as a BRM, you're sitting on both sides of the service supply and service delivery side. So you have an opportunity here to make real change. Okay, we won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but within the context of the matrix organization, there's really 3: weak matrix, balanced matrix, and strong matrix. Really, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but it just talks about the extent to which the project manager or the business analyst or the business relationship manager has the ability to influence. So within this slide here, we're really talking about the project manager, because they have a high degree of influence across this horizontal slice. But really, as a BRM, you should be thinking the same thing. If it's a weak matrix, a balanced matrix, or a strong matrix, my role as a BRM can have more or less influence across that slice. Another really good slide here too. We talked about this grid early on. This hasn't changed. This is the same one where we talk about the organizational cultures and what behaviors to expect from each of them. But you can see we've overlaid this now with the organizational structure. So now you can look at this and you can ask yourself, if I see a strong matrix structure, where am I likely to see it? Well, probably going to be a strong matrix is going to be focused on collaboration. So if my subculture, or if my teams, or even the broader organizational culture is focused on collaboration, probably a strong matrix structure is what I'm going to see. And if I don't see that, then I'd be asking, well, why? Why is this not a matrix structure? Why is it focused on functional and divisional structure? If we're supposed to be collaborating, the organizational structure isn't aligned to that. You're not getting the best level of collaboration if you're focusing on a functional and divisional structure. Now, the upper right focuses on control. Again, we were talking about, say, the military, for example. Functional and divisional structure makes sense. So now, if I am in an organization that's focusing on control, and I see that it's a matrix structure, question I'd have the same thing is why? If I'm focusing on a high level of control, the matrix structure is going to be focusing on collaboration, but that's not aligned to the organizational strategy, which is operational excellence. So now you can see the arrows are your organizational strategy. The blue text in each of the corners is your organizational structure, and the grid is your organizational culture. So this is another one of those slides, along with the previous one that we had the red font on. This one here is another one you probably want to print off and put it up on your cubicle or your whiteboard, because it really will tell you, especially as a contractor, when you come into an organization, here's the alignment. This is where the magic happens between the culture, the structure, and the strategy. Okay. So some interesting stories. Where have we seen organizations fail because of misalignment between strategy, culture, and structure? And again, put your BRM hat on here and ask yourselves, how can I get in front of this? If I see a misalignment between strategy, culture, and structure, how do I identify that misalignment? What can I do to influence a realignment there? And how can I modify either my behavior or influence the behavior of my team to ensure that that doesn't happen? Okay, so I won't go through all of these, but some of the big ones that come to mind, for example, is item number 4 here, organizational individual resistance to change. We look at Deming, Plan, Do, Check, Act. That model came out of his experience in World War II, where he would take information back from the front lines and apply that to the products that he was manufacturing for the war effort. He tried to apply that same level of what he called total quality management to the US automobile industry. Their response was, we don't sell cars, we service cars. That's where we make our money. So we're not interested in total quality management because we make our money servicing vehicles. So where did he go? He went to Japan. And look what happened. They actually took total quality management and built a culture around that. Every time a Japanese automobile would fail for whatever reason, the service records were sent right back to the factory, and the next iteration of that product would include the result of the improvement to that product. And as a result, it didn't take long, a couple of decades, and the Japanese automobile industry was eating the US automobile industry's lunch. And it was simply because of resistance to change. Kodak, item 5 here, they invented digital photography, and they're not around anymore because they saw it as something that would disrupt their primary product line, their primary source of revenue. And so even though they developed it, they shelved it. Of course, it didn't take long before it got out there and other people developed it. And next thing you know, nobody's buying film anymore. So there's a perfect example of not necessarily just resistance to change. They actually innovated, they had the ability to disrupt, but they shelved it and they just went back to the standard business model that had been successful for decades, but was coming to an end. Go down to failure to get external opinions on strategy, number 11. So a good one there would be, for example, we look at NASA in the 80s, the Challenger. There was every indication that there was going to be a problem with that flight back in 1986. They had a very strong functional management culture. Managers made decisions, not the engineers. And what happened was the whole organization was basically turned on its head. Instead of the engineers making the decisions and driving management to implement, management was making the decisions and driving engineers to implement. Engineers knew that there was going to be a problem with that Challenger flight in '86. They had done everything they could to notify management. Management decided that they were going to fly on that day, and we know how that ended. So you can see how important culture is, not just to the organizational strategy, but just to the complete success of the organization and even its longevity. So I'm willing to bet that anybody who looks at these 15 items here will probably see areas that resonate with their own personal experience, their professional experience, but also ask yourself when you go into an organization, are they doing any of these things? And if they are, how can you influence them to change? Because as a BRM, you probably can. Okay, well, lastly, let's go back to how did we do? At the beginning of the slide, we said we would talk about these items here, and I think we nailed it. There are some areas where I think that if you can just take away a couple of slides, one would be this one here. Definitely that one there is, if there is a magic bullet, and there isn't, but if there is, this would be it. And also this one here, I would encourage you to remember this one, the alignment between strategy and culture, which you can use to apply back to this slide here. So if you're looking at this on YouTube, pause here, take a picture of this, print it off, This one, and this one should be your best friends as a BRM. Ask yourself, when I go into an organization, how should I be adapting my behavior to align to the culture? Also, how can I influence the culture? Because you can. You may not think you can, but you'll find that especially when you're working with matrix teams across the organization, there's often areas organically what'll happen is the best of people's behaviors will start to surface. And your job as a BRM is to make sure that you capture that, celebrate that, and try and promote it. Plan your projects around that. Align your projects and your programs and your portfolios to the organizational strategy and determine your role in rewarding the appropriate behavior within your team. So I think we've nailed it there. I am definitely interested in your feedback. Feedback is a gift. If you have an opportunity to send along any questions, please reach out to info@corporateoasis.com. Don't forget your best friends at APMG International. Look at them for your certification and practice this leadership. That really kind of sums it up for me on this slide here. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I'd like to turn it back to Estelle here and thank her at APMG for allowing me the privilege to present to you today.
The privilege is all ours, Paul. Thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant, jam-packed, information-full webinar. Really, how we're giving this away for free, I don't know, but thank you very much indeed. It was superb to learn about the different cultures and the subsets and how you can not only understand but influence and actually create your own culture. That's fascinating, and I think those slides are brilliant. I'll be really, really surprised if people don't go on to download those in their thousands. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
As you quite rightly pointed out, if anybody wants to come and get BRMP training with you, you obviously deliver that at Corporate OASIS. So they can come to you for training and certification and get one of our lovely BRMP digital badges as well that goes alongside it. Yes, thank you very much for showing that on the screen. That's superb. And once again, as you also quite rightly point out, if anybody does have any questions on the webinar, then please do submit those to Paul and he can answer them, or you can contact us at APMG International.